All right, we're good. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Okay. Bismillah walhamdulillah ilah al-alamina. In the name of God, praise be unto God, the deity of the worlds. Welcome everybody to this second session of our slow reading of Ibn Arabi's Fusus al-Hikam. Just a few housekeeping. Last time there was a glitch on my end and also on Zoom's end, which I hope is fixed this time around, in that it didn't record for some reason, even though when I logged in, it basically told me that it was recording. So what I will do now is that it says that the recording is going to the cloud, but for some reason, once the session starts here, the actual recording function is not apparent, but right now it's giving me indication that there is a recording happening. Thanks be to God. So I think for this session, we are all good. Okay, so before we get into the text itself, and I should also say that if we go over an hour, it's not a problem. You know, those who want to stay can continue to stay, and those who want to leave, leave. I just want to get through the material that we need to get through for each session rather than, limit it to a specific time. And like I said, since it's recording, it's all good. So if people leave and miss something I have said or a discussion that has been made, they can then catch up on it on the videos. Okay, so I've got a couple of questions from people this week who are a little bit miffed by the logic of the text. If people followed what I was saying, this is all very deliberate. You have to pay very, very close attention and try to not to read so much with your intellect or as philosophers would say, do not try to read Ibn Arabi with your ratiocination, your rational intellect. Try to read him with your super rational intellect. And there's a very deliberate reason this is going on. But the first term that is miffed, at least one participant, is the term Adam itself. And this individual was a little bit confused as to who the Sheikh is talking about or what he is talking about. For me, it's very apparent. And if you pay very close attention and read him carefully, it's pretty apparent what he is talking about. He's using Adam in a kind of an archetypal sense. So I like this very great term that you find in Ismaili texts, Adam Rohani, or the spiritual Adam. So the entire chapter is basically about this subject, Adam Rohani, or as the perfect human being, the Insan al-Kamil. So the spiritual Adam is the universal archetype, but simultaneously, Ibn Arabi is using the example of Adam Abul Bashar, Adam, the father or the progenitor of humanity, in a particular sense. And this is part of the overall logic of how Ibn Arabi talks generally, throughout all of his texts. So here, Adam, it not just stands for Adam Abu Bashar, Adam, the progenitor of humanity, but also the universal Adam, which is inclusive of not just Adam himself, but also all the prophet messengers. And in Ibn Arabi's prophetology, from Adam himself to Khatam al-Nabi'in, Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And this is very much in keeping with also a kind of a botany prophetology that occasionally one comes across in various Shia hadith. For example, there's a very famous hadith that is quoted, especially by the Bab in his book of the 5 grades, where the prophet says, Ana Nabiyun, I am all the prophets, right? So when the terms such as Adam or Insan Kamil, or even the instantiations of the names of the other prophets are used throughout this text, they not just apply for the particular name that is being used for that chapter heading, that Fas, that Bezel, but are also applicable to everybody. So bear this in mind, and also bear in mind that we're dealing with a very interesting logic, or a very interesting non-dual dialectic, as I said in the podcast that I made with Salman. And this is not a dialectic of opposites, but it's more a dialectic of complements. So we are not dealing, for example, with itself, not itself, right? That then produces, some kind of a term of resolution between the opposites, but rather we're dealing with what might be called a sort of non-dual logic that we find, for example, in the logic of Stoicism, the tetralemma, or certain schools of Buddhism that apply the same kind of reasoning and logic, or super reason, where, for example, where the terms are, for example, itself, X, one term, not itself, Y, but then there is also both itself and not itself, X and Y. So Ibn Arabi does not believe in the law of the excluded middle that we find in Aristotelian and peripatetic logic. So this is a very important very, very important point that people need to bear in mind when reading Ibn Arabi. Let's see, why are these people not coming in? Okay, admit all. Here we are. Everybody's joining now. Okay. So this is the issue that people need to bear in mind, that the law of the excluded middle that is prevalent in rationalist systems of logic and philosophy, where Ibn Arabi is concerned, are completely inapplicable, and the resolution and the kind of approach that Ibn Arabi has to this question of reasoning and logic is extremely profound, and also simultaneously extremely controversial at the same time. But I think the manner in which he is dealing with this issue in the Fusus al-Hikam is beautiful. So what then does this methodology entail? So this methodology works in the following form, right? So take it sort of as like a sort of a hermetic meta-logic. So things have to be understood in both their as above, so below complements, right? So in that Emerald Tablet, when Hermes talks about as above, so below, this is the kind of logic that Ibn Arabi is applying throughout this text, and also in many of his other writings. So something, for example, in the case of Adam, when we are speaking of Adam Rohani, Daniel, can you turn off your mic, please? Thank you. So if we're talking about Adam Rohani, then it means that we must simultaneously talk about Adam Arzi, or the spiritual Adam and the terrestrial Adam simultaneously. So for our purposes, for this session and subsequent sessions, I'm going to coin two words which are already in use. I'm going to talk about archetype. Whenever I use the word archetype, you should take it as a celestial form or celestial reality, and prototype, and its terrestrial instantiation, right? So in this chapter of Adam, these two things are happening simultaneously in the discussion about the overall archetypal Adam. So the Adam Rohani is the Adam Abu Bashar simultaneously. And the method with Ibn Arabi is that we cannot even understand the Adam Rohani without at least detailing the instantiations of, at least on the narratival level of the Quran itself, about what this universal human, or what this universal Adam or spiritual Adam represents. So bear this methodology in mind. It is very important for your readings, and it also helps you then grasp the non-dual logic of Ibn Arabi a lot better. So everything has complements, right? So the two-term or the three terms of a syllogism, in the way that, for example, the peripatetic philosophers deals with it, is completely reformulated by Ibn Arabi, completely, where X and Y are both itself and not itself. So it's both X and Y, and not X and Y simultaneously. And this is important because let's see, somebody's trying to get in here, admit all. This is important precisely because the accusations, for example, of pantheism that are thrown at Ibn Arabi, or monism that are thrown at Ibn Arabi, when one pays attention to the logic that he's employing throughout his text and his just overall worldview, do not stick, because pantheism would entail a kind of a monochromatic relation without any gradation or any levels of understanding or hierarchy and that sort of thing. This is not occurring in Ibn Arabi at all. In fact, as we will see from the very first paragraph of Ibn Arabi's Fusus al-Hikam, the issue of God's tanzih, the God's or the Godhead's transcendence is asserted. And one can read a radical transcendence into this or a qualified transcendence into this. Nevertheless, Ibn Arabi does assert this transcendence. So then the terms that he's using to describe or delineate what this means become a matter of emphasis. And the understanding of this is then something that each individual has to approach for themselves. And this is in evidence, for example, in the numerous commentaries on the Fusus al-Hikam and Ibn Arabi's other works, where each of the commentators, especially from Sadruddin Qunawi to Dawood Qaysari, have their own approach to the question of transcendence. After Qaysari, most of these commentaries, in my opinion at least, seem to be iterations of Qaysari's own commentary in various forms. So everybody basically takes their cue from that big, massive commentary that Qaysari made of this Fusus al-Hikam. But overall, these are the issues. So let's delve into the first paragraph. And as I said on the group in Telegram, this first paragraph and the chapter as a whole, but especially the first paragraph, is in many ways Ibn Arabi's direct comment or commentary, gloss, on the hadith of the hidden treasure. The famous hadith, كنت كنزا مخفيا فأحببت أن أعرف فخلقت الخلق لأعرف. I was a hidden treasure and I desired to be known, therefore I created creation in order to be known. And so Ibn Arabi's text then is from this beginning paragraph, and I'll read the Arabic. لما شاء الحق سبحانه من حيث أسماء الحسنى التي يبلغها الأقصى أن يرى عيانها وأن شئت قلت وأن يرى عينه في كون جامع يحصر الأمر لكونه متصفا بالوجود ويسهر به سره عليه فإن روية الشيء نفسه بالنفس ما هي مثل روية نفسه في أمر آخر يكون له كالمرات فإنه تظهر له نفسه في صورة يعطيها المهل المنظور فيه مما لم يكن يظهر له من غيره وجود هذا المهل ولا تجليها له. And I have translated because I don't, even though we're reading these translations, I don't like any of them. Each of them sheds different hues. So I took the liberty of offering my own, making my own translation of this first paragraph, which is such a central statement. And I've translated as follows. Most of these guys don't translate the lama, when. So when the truly real willed from the situs of its most beautiful names, which cannot be comprehended by enumeration, that it should behold their essences, i.e. the names and attributes. Or if you prefer, that it should see itself in a comprehensive being containing the cause command of its being, characterized by existence and through which its secret would be manifested to itself. Because the vision of a thing itself by itself is not like seeing oneself in something else, which serves as a mirror. It is through this mirror that one's reflection appears, which the surface of the object being viewed allows, offering a perspective that would not be apparent without this locus or its theophanic self-disclosure. This is a very, very important premise that Ibn Arabi is offering from the very beginning of his Fusus. And what it is basically offering from a greater metaphysical perspective is that basically the transcendence of God, the kuntu kenzan, the kenzan makhfiyan, the hidden treasure, willed to create creation, right, as other. So in essence, the basis of duality, okay, as we would frame it in most logical systems and most philosophical and theological systems, the basis of duality is the desire of God itself, or the Godhead itself, to see itself as other, right? So this duality, in a sense, is a dualitude. And the term that unites it is the mirror. I deal with this question in my own response to Ibn Arabi's Fusus al-Hikam, which is still an ongoing text, my own Majali al-Hikam, the effulgences of wisdom, as to the nature of the mirror. Okay, why is this Zoom not automatically letting people in? Let me see here. Invite, join. There's nobody's getting admit. Here we go. All right. So let's go on to the following paragraph after that, which I have not translated yet. So the real gives or gave existence to the whole cosmos. And just remember, the cosmos here is Adam itself. As the first paragraph is insinuating, the real gave existence to the whole of the cosmos at first as an undifferentiated thing without anything of the spirit in it, so that it was like an unpolished mirror. And just recall the first chapter of Genesis, where in the chapter of Genesis talks about the tohu and the bohu. In that chapter, that the chaotic state of existence, in a sense, Ibn Arabi is echoing this. It is in the nature of the divine determination, okay, the ta'ayyun al-ilahiyya, that it does not set out a location except to receive a divine spirit, which is also called in the Quran the breathing into him, or breathing into her, per the verse that Ibn Arabi is citing. This is from the Surah Al-Anbiya, and it is in vague word talking about Mary. فَنَفَخْنَا فِيهَا مِنْ رُوحِنَا, and we blew the spirit of life into her, or we breathe our spirit into her. So it's talking about Mary. And I find this very interesting that in a discussion of Adam, this is precisely the Quranic verse that Ibn Arabi is citing. The latter, the breathing of the spirit, is nothing more than the coming into operation of the undifferentiated form's innate disposition to receive the inexhaustible overflowing of self-revelation, which has always been and will ever be. There is only that which is receptive, and the receptive has only been from the most holy superabundance of the truly real. For all power to act, all initiative is from it in the beginning and at the end. All command derives from it, even as it begins with it. Thus, the divine command required by its very nature the reflective characteristic of the mirror of the cosmos, and Adam, the cosmos, was the very principle of reflection for that mirror and the spirit of that form, while the angels were only certain faculties of that form, which was the form of the cosmos, called in the terminology of the folk, meaning the Sufis, the faculties in the human, which was the form called in the great man, or the Insan al-Kabir. But the Insan al-Kabir, who is Adam, is also another way of talking about the cosmos of the universe. In relation to it, the angels are as the psychic and physical faculties in the human formation. This is a very, very important point. In the understanding of Ibn Arabi's angelology, it's a very different kind of approach, but in essence, it is basically re-articulating a very similar framework as one would find in many botany approaches to the question of angelology. Each of these cosmic faculties or powers is veiled from the knowledge of the whole by its own self, being limited by its relative individuality, so that it cannot know anything that excels it. So each angel or psychic, universal psychic faculty is its own world, as it were. It also claims that it has the qualification for every high position and exalted abode with God by virtue of its participation in the greater divine synthesis, deriving both from the sphere of divinity and the realities of realities. And finally, with respect to the formation, assuming these characteristics from the exigencies of the universal natures, Tabi'a Kulliya, which contains and comprises all the receptivities of the cosmos, higher and lower. This knowledge can be arrived at by the intellect by means, cannot be derived by the intellect by means of any rational thought process, for this kind of perception comes only by a divine disclosure from which it is ascertained the origin of the forms of the cosmos receiving the spirits. The above-mentioned formation is called human and the vicegerent of God. So insan and Khalifatullah. As for the first term, insan, it stems from the universality of his formation and the fact that he embraces all the realities. But the reality, haqiqah, is as the pupil is for the eye through which the act of seeing takes place. Thus, he's called insan, meaning both man and pupil of the eye. For it is by him that the reality, haqiqah, looks on its creation and bestows the mercy of existence on them. So right here, a very subtle point is being asserted, such that what we can only know of God in our own station is of the universal human, of the insan al-Kamil, which is the cosmos. He is human, the transient in his form, the eternal in his essence. He is the perpetual, the everlasting, the at once discriminating and unifying word. It is by his existence that the cosmos subsists, and he is in relation to the cosmos as the seal is to the ring. The seal being that place whereon is engraved the token with which the king seals his treasure. So this is now highlighting why this book is even called the Fusus al-Hikam, the Bezel of Wisdom. So he's called the vicegerent or vice-regent, for by him God preserves his creation as the seal preserves the king's treasure. So long as the king's seal is on it, no one dares to open it except by his permission, the seal being, as it were, a regent in the charge of the kingdom. Even so is the cosmos preserved, so long as the perfect man or perfect human being and son of common remains in it. Do you not see that when he shall cease to be present in it, and when the seal on the treasure of the lower world is broken, none of what the reality preserved will endure, and all of it will depart. Each part, therefore, becoming reunited with every other part, after which the whole will be transferred to the final abode, where the perfect man, or the insan al-Kamil, will be sealed forever. All the names and attributes constituting the divine image, so that now the insan al-Kamil is the divine image, which is the meaning of God creating humanity in his own image, are manifest in the human formation, so that this information enjoys the degree by which it encompasses and integrates all existence. It is for this reason that God holds the conclusive argument against the angels in the Quran, in the protest at his command to prostrate to Adam. So take care, for God warns you by the example of another, and consider carefully from whence the arraigned one is charged. For the angels did not grasp the meaning of the formation of God's region, nor did they understand the essential servitude demanded by the plane of reality. For none knows anything of the reality save that which is itself implicit in the essence of the reality. The angels do not enjoy the comprehensiveness of Adam. Again, an assertion that the perfect human, or Adam, the universal human, is of a higher station or maqam than even the angels, and only comprehend those divine names peculiar or specific to them, by which they glorify and sanctify the truly real. Nor are they aware that God has names of which they know nothing about and which they cannot glorify him, nor are they able to sanctify him with the complete sanctification of Adam, the universal human. Their condition and limitation being what it is, they said concerning his formation, will you put in it one who will work mischief in it and shed blood? This is from the Quran. Meaning Adam's rebellion, which is precisely what they themselves evince. What they say of Adam applies equally to their own attitude towards the Al-High, the real. But for the fact that their own formation imposes this limitation of knowledge, they would not have said what they said concerning Adam, but they are not aware of this. If they indeed knew their own essential selves, they would know their limitation, and if that were so, they would have been spared their mistaken utterance. Furthermore, they would not have persisted in their challenge by calling attention to their own restricted glorification of God, as also their limited sanctification. Adam enshrines divine names, the angels have no part in, nor are they able to glorify their Lord by them or by them to exalt his transcendence as Adam does. God expounds the whole affair to us so that we might bear it in mind and learn from it the proper attitude toward him, unless we ignorantly flaunt what little individually restricted insight or understanding we might have realized. Indeed, how can we make claims concerning something the reality of which we have not experienced and concerning which we have no knowledge, without exposing ourselves to ridicule? The divine instruction concerning the angels is one of the ways by which the truly real instructs his most entrusted servants, his representatives, his khulafa. Let us now return to this wisdom. And this is very crucial. This is where now Ibn Arabi lays out the methodology of the preceding and the subsequent. This is where he talks about the intelligibles or universals and the particulars. Know that the universals, even though they have no tangible individual existence in themselves, yet are conceived of and known in the mind. This is certain. They're always unmanifest as regards individual existence, or the term being wujud aini, while imposing their effects on all such existence. Indeed, individual existence is nothing other than an outer manifestation of them, the intelligibles. That is to say, the universals or intelligibles. In themselves, they're always intelligibles of the mind. They are manifest as being individual beings, and they are unmanifest as being purely intelligible, without a material substrate. Every individual existence is dependent on the universals or intelligibles, which can never be disassociated from the intellect, nor can they exist individually in such a way that will cease to be intelligible or universal. Whether the individual being is determined temporarily or not, its relationship in both cases is one and the same. However, the universal and the individual being may share a common determining principle according as the essential realities of the individual beings demand. As for example, in the relationship between knowledge and the knower, or life and the living. So for example, we can point out to contents of knowledge, but we cannot point out to knowledge in its pristine universal sense. Same with life. We can point out to individuations or individual instances of life. You know, I'm alive, you're alive, the animal alive, the tree is living, etc. But to life in principle, we cannot point out. That is the intelligible. Life is an intelligible reality, as also knowledge, each being distinguished from the other. Thus, concerning the truly real, we say that it has life and knowledge, and also that it is living and knowing. This we also say of humanity and the angels. The reality of knowledge is always one, as is the reality of life, and the relationship of each respectively to the knower and the living remains always the same. Concerning the knowledge of the reality, we say that it is eternal, whereas of man's knowledge, we say that it is contingent. Consider then how attachment to the determinate, ta'ayyun, renders something in the intelligible reality contingent, and consider the interdependence of the universals and individual existence. For even as knowledge determines one who applies it as being a knower, so also does the one thus described determine the knowledge as being contingent in the case of the contingent knower, and eternal in the case of the eternal one, both determining and being determined simultaneously. Further, even though the universals are intelligible, they enjoy no real existence or real material existence, existing only insofar as they determine existent beings, just as they themselves are determined in any relationship with individual existence. As manifest in individual existence, they may admit of being, in a sense, determined, but they admit of no particularization or division, this being impossible. They are essentially present in each thing they qualify, as humanity is present in every human being, while not being particularized or divided according to the number of individual beings that exist in which they are manifested, remaining purely intelligible. So the archetype of humanity that replicates and instantiates itself again and again and again in individual humans is the universal, and the human is the particular. But the archetype itself does not admit to division because it is an archetype. The prototype does, which are the instantiations of it. If, therefore, it is established that there is an interrelationship between that which has individual existence and that which has not, the latter being non-existent relations, the interconnection between one individual being and another is the more comprehensible because they have at least individual existence in common, whereas in the former instance, there is no unifying element. And I'll leave it here. This is half of the text of the first chapter of Adam. And now's the time to throw your questions.
Well, I don't necessarily have a question so much as like an idea I'm getting out of it. Well, when it talks about basically the angels not bowing to Adam, and it's because they don't understand the servitude required. I get out of that it's actually the higher calling is to get your hands dirty.
Yeah, this is a very, very subtle point. One of the points that Qaisari in his commentary in the Fusus raises, which is great, and everybody else then basically repeats it afterwards, is that what are we talking about in this particular chapter in Fusus in the Quran itself, about those angels that refused to bow to Adam? And then the issue of Iblis, and then the controversy about whether Iblis is a jinn or an angel, etc., etc. Qaisari's resolution is beautiful. Basically, he says that because the angels are basically instantiations of God, so we cannot really talk about angels as separate entities. And if you go into the names of angels in Hebrew, you'll see this because each name of angel is actually an attribute of God. For example, Gabriel or Jibrail in Arabic, Gabriel in Hebrew means the power of God. So Qudratullah or Quwwatullah in Arabic. Samail, which is usually sometimes an angel and then becomes a demon, means basically the venom of God, right? So these are like attributes of God. So what do we mean by angel? Qaisari resolves the issue as such. He says that, the Quran is not really talking about, the angels of the realms of Jabarut and the higher realms of Malakut. He's basically talking about the lower level, lower level Malakuti angels and the angels of the terrestrial world. So the terrestrial angels is what the Quran and also Ibn Arabi are talking about. And these are, just to call them angels is a placeholder. Now, this is a very, very interesting point because throughout botany literature, Ismaili, all the way into the Bayan, when we're talking about angels, we're not talking about, disincarnate beings, who are servants of God. We're talking about actual human beings. So, for example, in the Bayan, the angels stand for the letters of the living, the disciples of the Bab himself. In earlier Ismaili literature, the angels stand for the believers, or in some sects of Ismailism, they stand for basically the closest companions of the Ismaili imam or leader. I've even seen certain Sufi texts which have a kind of crypto-Ismaili edge to them, where the angels, refer to the disciples of the pure, the murids, the immediate inner circle of a given murshid or whatnot. So this is a very interesting point of departure that even Arabi and his school take about this, because it has a very direct resonance to a very crypto Ismaili and botany kind of understanding of the nature of the angels. But by the same token, they're also allowing the existence of higher level entities or intellects beyond the realms of Malakut, etc., who have no problem with Adam because they have no will. And this is something that the Quran also mentioned, that the angels don't have any will of their own. So the way that Henry Corbin then addresses this issue is that when we talk about angelologies, we have to talk about in terms of an angelophany. So the appearance of angels, which in themselves is a theophany, the appearances of God, or self-disclosure of God, the appearance of light. They are not separate beings. So therefore, the gloss on this particular chapter of Adam in the Quran, and the way that Ibn Arabi then deals with it in the Fusus, is that we're talking about men, other humans, right? Who, for example, Adam comes with the mission as the first prophet to humanity, or if you want to take the botany point of view, which Ibn Arabi then articulates later in the Futuhat al-Makkiyah itself, that there are multiple worlds with multiple Adams in them. Basically, Adam represents the vicegerent or the envoy or the messenger of God, and the angels who protest with God are the ones, in essence, who reject the mission of Adam, who fail to be swayed by his mission. So in the context of, let's say, the history of Islam, at the very beginning of the mission of the Prophet Muhammad, when he comes to the Quraysh and tells them, La ilaha illallah, there's no God but God, put away your idols, and they refuse him, they are the angels who fall, right? And by disputing the veracity of the prophet. Or if not the Quraysh themselves, the pagans, then the Christians and the Jews in the Hijaz, who are believers, are technically monotheists, but then they refuse to accept the messenger who has come to them with the message from God. And this is very much in keeping with the kind of the botany gloss that we have in a lot of the botany literature about who the angels represent. So we have this whole as above, so below thing going on within the Quran itself, because those entities and those beings in the higher realms are not subject to the kind of ignorance that is specific to the spatial temporal experience within the terrestrial world, right? They are not veiled in the manner. So when the divine command is issuing, it is an instantaneous recognition, because those entities and beings in this kind of cosmologies are also the transmitter and carriers of every single command from the higher to the lower worlds. So angels here is basically a stand-in for the terrestrial prototype rather than the celestial archetype. And so this is how then this issue is resolved. And the beautiful way that Qaysari resolves this issue is already implied within Ibn Arabi himself, but he puts it very succinctly. And it gets especially interesting when he starts to discuss the nature of the devil, Satan itself, since in this cosmology, the entire plane of existence is the manifestation of the names and attributes of God. Who is Iblis, or Satan, other than the manifestation of the name of God, al-Mudil, the one who misleads or who leads astray? A word that we find in its verbal noun in the very first chapter of the Fatiha, in the very last verse of his, where he talks about, it says, and antu alayhim qayril maghdubi alayhim maladali. Those you have bestowed upon your grace, and those gone astray. Whereby then the two terms are established, those possessing of grace and those who have fallen away from the grace. And so the dhalin, or the mudil, the one who misleads and has gone astray, is the devil itself, which then again, once again, is open to a very botany interpretation, which the Bayan very explicitly articulates in its own text, that the devil or the shaitan is basically in each dispensation of the appearance of the insan al-kamil, is the first one who rejects that message and who becomes the avowed enemy of the prophet message. So in the context of Islam, the first leading antagonist of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is the devil. Whether we're talking about Abu Sufyan, Lahab, or the Christians or the Jews that opposed them, the first amongst them becomes the devil, is the manifestation of the divine name, the misguider. So this also then provides a extremely powerful subtext as well as context to the understanding of the nature of Tawheed, because even in the Quran, there's a verse off the top of my head, I don't know the number of it, where it says that for each prophet we have appointed an adversary. So the Quran itself is also asserting that even in the adversarial positions that occur in dispensations, in the beginning of dispensations of divine revelation, this itself is a divine command, right? In the way the Quran talks about it in his studies, it talks about the necessity of the divine dramaturgy. There's always a dramaturgy going on, and God is behind the dramaturgy, basically on both terms of it. Now, what does this do to the question of fate and free will? Ibn Arabi doesn't have a problem whatsoever in accepting the premise that was uttered by the mouth of one of the Imams, peace be upon them, where the Imam says, "La jabr wa la tafwiz al-amrayn amrayn," neither predestination or complete free will. The matter is in between the two. So there is a level of freedom of choice, but then again, there is a determinant to that freedom of choice. And the kind of metaphysical edifice that Ibn Arabi offers, and which is scattered also in the Shia Hadith literature, is basically offering that framework to understand the difference between these two, between the notion of free will and predestination. Any other questions? Marias?
Yeah, I have a question. So there's this idea of the primacy of the Muhammadan light. I was wondering
what
how
again?
the Muhammadan light, like the light of Muhammad,
Yeah, Nur
sallallahu
Muhammad.
alaihi wasallam.
Yeah.
So I was wondering how that meshes into this entire ontology of the
Completely.
primacy of Adam as well.
Completely. See, what Ibn Arabi is doing in this first chapter is basically laying out the introductory arguments and articulations of the notion of the Nur Muhammadi. So Adam is Nur Muhammadi, just as Muhammad is Nur Muhammadi. All of the prophets are the same. And I mentioned that hadith, Ana Nabiyu. This is a famous hadith from the Prophet. I am all of the prophets. So what Ibn Arabi is doing here is basically re-articulating all of this, but by using each name of a prophet as kind of the perspective as to unpack this reality. So Adam is the Nur Muhammadi, even though the prototypical Adam is still between water and clay, while the Nur Muhammadi is already a prophet, right? And so on and so forth. But nevertheless, Adam himself, the prototypical Adam within himself, is also the Nur Muhammadi, or the Haqiqa Muhammadi, which is the term that Ibn Arabi uses.
Okay, great, thank you.
Is there a way to list all the characters so far mentioned in the first chapter? Like he mentions primordial being, God, angels, and just like a brief explanation. I was just having a hard time following along the book. So,
okay, can you be more specific?
I didn't write it down. Maybe I can be more specific in the next session.
Or why don't you write it for me? Maybe go through these first 4 pages in the Austin text, highlight them, and just send them to me.
Will do.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, so I have a question. It was related to the first one. So
Sure.
would this mean that I guess people who are evil or not very morally upright, they themselves are also manifestations of like the names of wrath of God? So
Yes.
then would that mean that I guess if things are between determinism and free will, what did that say for their salvation, or so like soteriology? I'm sorry, I can't pronounce that, but
Yes.
how would that how would that work in Ibn Arabi's system? I don't know if he covers that later on, but that's something that's, I guess, it's a very interesting in a kind of morbid way.
Arabi does not believe. I mean, this is one of the most controversial positions of Ibn Arabi to this day that is drives a lot of people, theologians and exoteric people crazy. Even Arabi does not believe in universal damnation. He believes in universal salvation. So there, he says things, for example, in his Futuhat, that at the end of time, in the Qiyamat al-Qiyamat, even the denizens of hell itself will find the mercy of God at the end of things. So the question is that, yes, absolute evil does not exist in the cosmology of Ibn Arabi, but relative evil does. And relative evil exists in the plane of spatio-temporality. And I guess the choice is made by each individual according to their predisposition or their preparedness as to which of the terms to use and to then become its manifestation. So, for example, if the choice for good is made based on the predisposition of the individual, then the names and attributes that are Jamali manifest through that person. Whereas if they choose the opposite, if they make the wrong choice or wrong in the relative sense, then the names of Jalal, such as Qahr and Qabs and etc., or Dhil, misguidance, are the ones that then manifest through them. So on one hand, the choice being made by virtue of the predisposition, the istidad of each individual person, is the free choice. But once that choice is made, one can say that then the determinant is the name that then, basically possesses or, guides, or for lack of a better word, that person in the course of actions that they take. And then the relative manifestations of good or evil, rather, in this case, that come from this person's actions.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Sure.
Just in relation to what you just said, if the prophets are insan kamil, then I think it's implied that they manifest all of the names.
Yes.
I think it was in Toshiko Izutsu's book that I saw it, but I don't remember what yeah. So something like the Prophet Muhammad, for example, peace be upon him, would have all of the names of Jalal and Jamal. I mean, we wouldn't want to say that he's evil, but I'm wondering about how certain Jalali attributes would manifest through the life of someone like the Prophet.
This is a good question, very good question. Yes, first of all, you're right. The Insa Kamal, or the perfect humans, are the plane of manifestation of all the names of attributes. And it's good that you brought this up, because the name Allah is associated with the first chapter of the Fusus, which is the all-comprehensive name, right? So the prophet messengers are the plane of the manifestation of all the names of attributes. And that is inclusive of the Jamali, the beatific, and the Jalali, the majestic. Which means that that a given prophet messenger can act within the realities of both sides of the proverbial plot, from the soft, the merciful, and also from the Qahri and Jalali, the wrathful, etc. Right? Because these are both of them are the balance of creation. One also being an instantiation of transcendence, the Jalal, while the other one being that of immanence and Jamal. And yes, it's only the perfect human, and it does say this. It does say this in the Fusus al-Hikam, that the perfect human, or the insan al-kamil, it can do both, because that perfect human is the manifestation of God, period, by virtue of being the manifestation of the all-comprehensive name. So just like we have that verse in the Quran, you did not throw when you threw, but God threw. But it was through the hand of Muhammad when he threw during the Battle of Badr, right? But other than the narrative, what this is symbolizing is that when the hand of the Prophet throws, when the hand of the Insan of Kamen throws, or the action or the fill of the Insan of Kamen is the fill of God, by virtue of being the repository or depository of all the names and attributes, the mahal the locus of the manifestation of all the names and attributes of the Godhead.
So for example, the prophet would also be a misguider, but
Yes.
it would be in something like in relation to certain people. It
Yes.
would be in a just way.
Hence the verse, Makaru wa makarullah wallahu khairul makirin. They conspire and God conspires, and verily God is the greatest of all conspirators, right? In relation to the, kind of the chess match that was going on between the Medinans and the Quraysh in Mecca, and the war that eventually resulted in Badr and then Uhud, and then the final victory of the Muslims. But who in this instance was the prophet misguiding in this makr, in this kind of ruse that was going on, which is one of the meanings of the word makr as well, this ruse that was going on in the engagement between these two sides. One side thought that they were misleading the other, but it was really God through Muhammad that was misleading Quraysh unto their own defeat at the hands of the Muslims. This, by the way, I mean, you think about this, contrary to the somewhat, I would say, kind of childish approach one often finds, for example, in the New Age movement, where if something is not all love and light, then it's untrue and should be shunned, and these people are unspiritual. The kind of perspective that Ibn Arabi is throwing is that everything is already always spiritualized, right? And so what he's trying to do is trying to put the focus on the nature of that spirituality. So even misguidance, wrath, anger, etc., 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 these also have spiritual roots. Everything has a spiritual root by virtue of existing, right? Which is the term here, wujud. And so there's a verse, I think it's in the Futuhat al-Makkiyah, where he says outright, do not deny anything. A verse of poetry, never to deny anything absolutely, even if you deny it relatively, because everything has a spiritual root by virtue of existing, of participating in that universal existence, which is the theophany, self-disclosure of the being of the Godhead, of Allah. So what does this say about attitudes of do and don't? This is always the issue that comes up with religion. Is what is the purpose of having the religious law or the Sharia? Ibn Arabi does then address this issue, but the way, and we will get to that as we go further into the book, because as it stands, if you take this as a premise as is, then basically we can dispense with everything, and whether I'm misguided or guided, it's all God. Yes, but each term also carries its own reality, its own haqiqah. As human beings, these fragile but powerful creatures living in spatial temporality, every choice that we make and the energy that we carry along with it comes with its own string of karmic consequences and energies, etc., etc. So Ibn Arabi is not saying nothing is without consequences.
Hello.
He is actually he is asserting consequentiality to everything, whatever term is chosen. Go ahead.
That's just a test.
Okay.
No, I'm just struggling with this everything is God idea. The whole everything is God, everything is spirit, and where's the line between good and evil? Somebody mentioned Jalali as evil, and I wonder, is that normal in Islam that when you hear the word Jalal, you think evil right off the bat?
No. There's the word evil, and the closest correlate to the word evil that we have in Arabic is su. Jalali nature is not by its nature su or evil. Jalali by its nature, the better way to look at this is through the pole of the masculine and the feminine. So take the Jalali as being masculine and the Jamali as being feminine, right? Rather than good and evil. The Kabbalah does this with the tree of life, and I've always had a problem with that approach. So what he's trying to convey here is that even the good, the bad and the su, the good and the bad itself, are rooted in much more dynamic principles than theology can capture. He is not saying without qualification that everything is God, right? This is where one has to read it in Arabic very carefully. Like I pointed out from the very first paragraph, he's not saying that. He is saying instead everything is in Goded, which is very different than saying everything is God in a kind of a monochromatic sense. You may get that in the West in someone like Spinoza, but you will not get with Ibn Arabi. There's a nuance that's going on here, and like I said, paying attention to kind of the non-Aristotelian kind of logic that Ibn Arabi is approaching, where something's itself, then the opposite term, not itself, and then the synthesis is both itself and not itself simultaneously. And everything, assertions about things are based and true to the degree of the standpoint. So whatever standpoint you are at, a statement may be true or false. At another standpoint, when you look at the same thing, the statement may appear differently, maybe appear false, maybe appear true. So it is the standpoint of the witness, and this is a very, 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 very subtle point, determines the truth or falsity of a given statement, right? So rather than go into everything is God, right? Because the two terms of the tahleel of the shahada are la ilaha illallah, negation and affirmation, right? And these two occur within a dialectic, but by the same token, they are a single phrase. La ilaha illallah is a single phrase composed of two clauses, verse of negation and affirmation. And meditating on this, as a lot of Sufis do, on the la ilaha illallah from this vantage point, then begins to unpack and make understandable this kind of dialogical dialectic, non-dualistic dialogical dialectic that someone like Ibn Arabi is, in my opinion, successfully employing in a text like the Fusus al-Hikam. And even though the argument is very compact and epitomized, but if you sit down and very carefully kind of unpack it for yourself, this is where using these dhikrs associated with these chapters that I gave are very important, where you use the zikr and think about the issues that you're reading about. Try to visualize them in your own mind. I mean, we're not trying to encourage delusion by such an exercise, but when you use the zikr and you very carefully think about the terms that Ibn Arabi is spelling out, by itself, very slowly but surely, these start to make a little bit more sense as time goes by.
I guess I would just like to interject something to loop back to what you said at the beginning, because you brought up the emerald tablet as above, so below.
Yeah.
I know Ibn Arabi was acquainted with things like alchemy, astrology, these kind of sciences, and from astrology, I mean, there are forces, stars, planets that are essentially described in every text as being bad, evil. And you can't really attribute that to human beings. Obviously, it's something that's created by God or created by the cosmos, I guess, in its own unfolding. So, if we're dealing with the microcosm, macrocosm idea, and human beings being that is a reflection of the cosmos, that does go back to that the natal constellation, that which governs your life, or not really governs, but plays a role in influencing your predispositions, I would say.
Sure.
So I guess, and of course there are bad things there and bad things that happen. And that's more something you see in the medieval texts, and that's something they had to grapple with, because these were Christians, these were Jews, these were Muslims, and they're trying to come to terms with the fact that, the heavens are not like, pure bliss and pure joy. There's some, less pleasant aspects, at least from our perspective. But I suppose, I guess it would be more acceptable in a medieval context, which Ibn Arabi was writing in, than, like you said, a new age, everything's lovely. I mean, it's really something that isn't founded.
Let me, it's a good question. Let me start from this perspective. In Ibn Arabi's larger worldview, the cosmos, the world, is not a unfriendly place. It's actually quite a friendly universe, even with all of its chaos, calamities, and quote unquote, put this word in brackets, evil. Now, on the question of this planetary influences, if you look at the Quran itself, where it mentions the constellation, there is no mention of either salutary or unsalutary influences of the constellation. It only asserts that God created them, right? Now, given the kind of types of human beings that exist, right, if there are malevolent or maleficent influences of one planet, this should apply to everybody universally. But there are only certain types of people. For example, take the planet Saturn, that seems to drive, that creates a lot of problems for a lot of people. I've never had a problem with Saturn. In fact, Saturn doesn't influence me negatively, never has. I actually like the planet very much. So, but why is that? Whereas somebody else, where, as Saturn is ascendant in their natal chart, in a negative aspect, whenever it is, their life is topsy-turvy, they're going through hell and back and all the rest of it. Why is that? So it is the predisposition of that particular person is where Saturn becomes malevolent as an influence. Whereas for someone like me and similar, it is the opposite. Okay? So this needs to be explained, because the question of good and evil, if it is framed from a universal sense, as the Gnostics did, the capital G Gnostics did, or as, exoteric religion strives to do, creates innumerable philosophical problems of a very tangible nature, right? So both good and evil from one perspective, and from the perspective that Ibn Arabi is articulating, are relative things, right? And so this standpoint epistemology that I'm talking about very much applies in the way that we should perceive things. Now, why do I mention this? I mean, this whole course comes out of that theurgy list. I am seeing, and I've, amongst Muslims, that people do not have this particular perspective. And so magic doesn't work for them. Theurgy doesn't work for them. And why is that? Is because they are closing themselves off by virtue of probably a flawed understanding about the nature of good and bad, and especially where the planets are concerned, or even where the jinn are concerned, where they automatically are veiling themselves from participation, as it were, in this greater cosmic flow that theurgy, proper approach to theurgy, allows. And so my belief is a text like the Fusus al-Hikam of Ibn Arabi, if properly internalized and properly understood, can allow people to take that step to allow then theurgy to work for them in such a way. Because the whole basis, like for example, of these first pages that we're reading, and as we will read more, Ibn Arabi is delineating the dynamic and the logic of how the names and attributes operate, what they even are. So when he's talking about the universals and particulars, the intelligibles and their instantiations, it is the names of and attributes that he has in mind, right? And so what does a theurgist do? A theurgist is working with these names and attributes, and on the planetary level, he's applying these names and attributes in order to work with these planetary beings. Or forget about the jinn, right? So once we have a correct understanding of these things, right, then we can approach the magic and the theurgy in its proper practical form in a much more powerful way. Then we are really theurgists in a true sense of the word, right? So going back to your question, yes, the medieval texts, whether they're in their Arabic or Hebrew or whatever language, do phrase these issues of planetary astrology in terms of good and evil. You will also find this in the pseudo-Majriti text of Baqayat al-Hakim, the Picatrix. This is also framed in a similar way, but Ibn Arabi is basically breaking from that particular tradition as a Sufi, and as a very deep esotericist beyond even the Sufism, in reframing these things and trying to shed a perspective on the relativity of these sorts of relationships and what particular path to approach this whole thing by in a more proper way. Without necessarily, I might add, negating the relative evil or the relative good of these things, the planetary influences.
Yeah, I would agree. I think because Ibn Arabi's, I guess he's on a higher level in terms of
Yes.
understanding the whole and the dialectic in its whole instead of just one term, and then you take the term in isolation and you don't get the whole. So I hope that is something that we'll get like some sort of I guess a taste of as we go through this text. But it's very interesting so far. And I guess just one other quick question. I'm sorry, I don't want to hog the mic too long, but
no worries. That's why we're here.
So it's kind of like I guess maybe I'm misunderstanding, but would the universal nature that he's referring to, it is the same as a universal soul of like Neoplatonism, or is it
yeah, sure,
another kind of topic? Okay.
Yeah, he also mentioned I think it was in the second page of the Austin text, the Tabi'a Kulliya, the universal nature. Yeah, this is very much the case.
Oh, yeah, because I know that in I think the introduction, either the Austin or the Abrahamov introduction, it says that he incorporates Neoplatonism and these sort of terms in, and I'm kind of like trying to get how the universal intellect and soul relates to like the names, attributes, and how that all comes together into one cohesive like whole like understanding where they each in relation to each other.
They all interact with each other. One way to look at this, I was going to leave this for a later session, but one way to look at this, this particular angle is very important in the Shaykhi school and in the Bayan. But even with Ibn Arabi, he talks in these terms. So, for example, we talk about the unicity of the essence, Tawhid al-Dhat. Then we speak about the unicity of the names and attributes, Tawhid al-Asma wa Sifat. Then we talk about the Tawhid al-Af'al, the unicity of the acts, and then finally Tawhid al-Ibadah, the unicity of worship or servanthood, or however you want to put it. And these are 4 terms. So if you look at it from that angle, then all of these various hierarchies are interpenetrating each other. And in some instances, you can speak of all of them as kind of being the same thing. And the term that Ibn Arabi uses for the comprehensiveness of all these various levels as one is haqiqat al-haqa'iq. Whereas he mentions this at one level, he talks about the divine, the martaba al-ilahiyya, the divine level. That is basically referring to the level of the Godhead, whether we're talking about the ahadiyya wahidiyya and its self-disclosure. But then when all these other levels that are part of it, including the universal nature, the universal soul, and the spatial temporal plane of matter, etc., and all the beings and whatnot are in it, this all comprehensiveness is then referred to as the reality of realities.
Thanks. That may I guess it's starting to become clearer now.
Alhamdulillah.
Sheikh, I would want to ask back to the question about the angels, the Malaika. What I get from the text, somehow they are represented as intellectual faculties, قوى إنسانية. And what is interesting to me, that these intellectual faculties that we have, they are in some sense they have their own life and they are independent in themselves. And something, but there is the hadith of Junudul Aql wa Junudul Jahl, that we are the commander which commands their faculties to be one complete whole.
Yeah.
How would you comment on this point?
It's interesting that you instance this hadith, the first of the hadiths in Khulani's al-Kafi. Note that one of the statements that the Imams makes in reference to that hadith is that Jah is the sister of the Aql, Ukht al-Aql, right? And I've spent many years thinking about this and what this is talking about, which is basically saying is very something similar to Ibn Arabi already, that the term Aql and Jah cannot be separated from one another in the plane of manifestation. So what does that say about the angels? What does that say about the angels is that the angels as instantiations of God's theophany also on one level can be said to hold their own individuation. But this individuation is not separate simultaneously from the greater term that existentiated this being the Godhead. And like I mentioned, when you look at the names of angels, whether in Arabic and Hebrew, when you turn it back into Hebrew, they're actually speaking about attributes of God itself. So what exactly then are the angels other than angelophanes? The appearance, of angels as theophanies. Go ahead.
Thank you. That was my question.
Okay.
So, in some sense, can we say that these intellectual faculties or this quwa, they are a manifestation of, let's say, some of the God attributes or of God names, but we, let's say the insan kamil or the aql of what is the most inner aspect of the human, it is related to God, the manifestation of God essence itself, which is in some sense destined to organize in one whole all of these faculties.
Sure. Put it another way, the antagonism from the perspective of that particular Shia hadith, the antagonism between Aql and Jah produces the outcome. To give an example, so the antagonism and the war between the Meccans and the Medinans at the inception of Islam produced the tradition of Islam that then, went beyond its own borders, it subdued the Meccans themselves, and created a civilization as a result. So this is why, in my opinion, at least from my reading of the statements of the Imams, that Jah is the sister of Aql. This is one of the references that are making, that these two poles of the dialectic are actually then producing something where the first pole of the dialectic is the dominant party and basically utilizes its opposite as a complement to produce something greater than itself, as it were. And so once we get to this dialogic of Jalal and Jamal, in the way that Ibn Arabi is dealing with it, this is why, I think getting away from notions of even the terms that are used, for example, in the hadith of Aql and Jah, is not helpful, because when we look at, or the way that Mu'ezzi or Idris Samawi Hamid have translated this term of Aql as higher intelligence or nexal consciousness, right? If we take their definitions, which is fabulous, this is good, right? As long as we don't look at the Jah as necessarily being a antagonist of an equal nature. There is no equality here between these two, right? Whereas with Jamal and Jalal, it's different. With Jamal and Jalal, these are both equal aspects of the Godhead, right? And the way to understand it is, you see this in a lot of the text, the Jalali aspect being the transcendental nature of God. It's remote, it's harsh, you can't reach it. And then there is the immanent aspect of God, which is soft, feminine, always present, merciful, compassionate, etc. And these two are simultaneously present at the same time. equally.
And last, not to take very much of your time.
Someone else has a question.
Go ahead.
Just last note. The difference, the Jalali and Jamali, they are both real and existent in comparison, as we mentioned earlier, to good and evil. That we can say that both of them exist, but known in the same sense, because the evil cannot be absolute, but only relative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just like, for example, to give the example, why evil is relative. For example, in the situation of a war. To the Muslims who subdued the Meccans, this was good. But to the pagan Meccans who were subdued by the Muslims, this was evil because their way of life was completely destroyed forever, right? So this is where the relativity of evil itself comes to play. The misguidance of Adam, according to the commentary of Qaisari, is quite an interesting example of this, where he puts his finger that in a sense, the disobedience of the first man and woman to God was a necessary function. So that name inherent in Adam, misguiding them out of the garden, was essential, because as a result of the misguidance and their getting kicked out of the garden, a whole dramaturgy of humanity emerges, and a whole cycle begins that then eventually leads to the Qiyamah. Then the kind of the apokatastasis at the end of this, where everything then returns back to the celestial garden. This is one way of looking at it. But there was a necessity, in a sense, for this disobedience to happen.
I was going to say something similar about how the angels refused to bow to Adam. I think it's the same explanation. I mean, they didn't have any choice. They had to refuse. If they didn't refuse, we wouldn't be here.
Yeah, well, that's another way of looking at it. As long as we take this as a symbolic narrative and not as a literal story.
Yeah.
Because in the Gnostic literature, capital G, there's this whole notion that then also enters into Gnostic Judaism of fallen angels and etc. Even Ari would have a terrible time accepting this concept, because angels cannot fall. Angels are basically instantiations of the Godhead itself. There is no falling. So then, we then have to unpack the meaning behind of the angels, or what the angels are. We then have a problem with accepting Adam, and they're in many ways right. This being that God creates with his two hands goes on to basically shed oceans of blood throughout history. But by the same token, Adam is God's vice-regent, vicegerent, the Insan of Kamel, the depository of all the names of God. He's the manifestation of the name Allah. So God knows something that the angels know, because the angels can only encapsulate one particular name and one particular modality of knowing God. Whereas Adam, as the universal human, contains all perspectives about God. And hence why he is the form that God creates to look at the mirror. This is the thing. So the whole summum bonum of creation, for God to be able to look at creation to see himself in totality, is contained in Adam as the Insan Kamel, which is then all of the prophets, all the way to Muhammad. Muhammad being Adam, Adam being Muhammad, etc., etc.
Well, I'd like to go on to.
I think Hossein Jaffrey was out after you, before you, Matt. Let get a question. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. This is a little bit different from what we've been talking about, but it seems important because it's in this chapter. The whole thing about universals, I think it's kulliyat in the Arabic.
Ma'qulat, intelligible.
I'm just trying to understand the. So. Ma'qulat. I think also. Okay. Trying to understand the ontology of these things. I'm thinking about like how in Suhrawardi it's the the intellect the intelligibles are like real things. They are individual existing entities. In Ibn Arabi, he says that they don't have existence.
They don't have, no, he says they don't have wujud al-ayniyah, which is a very, very important thing. What wujud ayniyah means is that they don't have any concrete material existence. They are more like spiritual substrates for the instantiation of their material forms.
Okay, I see. Are these the same as the names?
Yes, the names are also magulat because they're relations, right? There is the unity of God. This is what Ibn Arabi is also trying to very slowly wean people off. If you make of the divine names as concrete instantiations, you fall into a trap of idolatry by making gods of the names. Okay, this is why there is a saying in the Nahj al-Balagha of Ali alayhi salam, where he says that it's one of the first khutbahs, that the ultimate knowledge of God is to strip all attributes of it, right? So we can understand God by the names and attributes, but by the same token, we must then strip any concrete realities to these names. And by doing so, we understand that the totality exists in the particularity. So the totality is present within each individuation of the thing. And this is why he brings up the discussion of the intelligibles to begin with, so we can then understand what these names and attributes are, both to distinguish them one from the other, but also to then understand their universal nature simultaneously. It is a difficult argument, but I tell you this, Ibn Arabi actually simplifies this as compared to a lot of the peripatetic texts. The Aristotelian or the Neoplatonic Aristotelian Islamic philosophers, almost for every philosopher, there's one unique theory of the intelligible, and there are a lot of disagreements between them. You have one theory from al-Kindi, then another from al-Farabi, then Avicenna kind of augments all of this, and then some of his students augment him, and then on and it goes, and then there's differences between the way that Nasiruddin Tusi approaches the question versus where like someone like Bahman-Yar, Avicenna's student, approach it, and and a lot of dispute. Whereas with Ibn Arabi, he's simplified it, right? It is controversial in the way that he articulates, but nevertheless, it's a very simplified and acceptable theory of what the intelligibles are. Anybody else? Matt?
Well, yeah, well, I was wondering, I had one point to make, and then Hussein made a point that I also want to continue with. When you're talking about the disobedience of Adam and Eve is inevitable. Not inevitable in terms of necessary to the story, so to speak, although there's a part of that, but also just an inevitable organic necessity. If we look at, because many will look at the Garden of Eden on a symbolic level of a baby's psychology.
Sure.
And that they're just like, babies don't judge good and evil. I mean, that is what the tree of knowledge they ate from, was the knowledge of good and evil. Babies don't judge that. They're just like, oh, this is interesting, so when they might not like something, sure, but it's not really evil. It's just, I don't like it. When it's only at a certain point where, often thanks to mommy and daddy's teaching, sometimes incorrect teaching, that we start getting judgmental.
Sure.
And to then go back a little bit to the idea of the attribute, being, the angels being an attribute. If we look at polytheism, a lot of their gods and goddesses, small g, are personifications of an attribute. That does not, still, Allah being the only one worthy of worship, absolutely, but it doesn't mean you take the attributes and try to say that they're not important or they're evil or anything like that. They're just what you understand and hopefully work with, which is the cultists. That's what we're doing, is trying to work with in some way.
Hold on to that as we get further into the text, because this sort of issue is addressed. But from whether my point of view or from the point of view of Ibn Arabi, take the story of the Garden of Eden as a kind of an initiatic tale. I mean, I unpack this, I unpack this story in a completely radical way in my own text of my own rewrite or my own response to Ibn Arabi. Completely, I don't accept the exoteric narrative at all, and I actually base myself on some of the statements of the Imams. Like, for example, Eve being created from Adam's rib. This is completely rejected in the Imami literature.
As well as science.
Well, yeah, but even from a symbolic, we're talking from a symbolic. Yeah. I mean, we're not taking this literal. We're taking this symbolic as a kind of an initiatic tale. That's a completely separate thing. But where the names and attributes are concerned, these are relations, greater relations of things. Which means that even from a greater perspective, going back to the question of Jamal and Jamal, something can be Jamali Jalali and Jalali Jamalik. It can be a majestic beauty or a beatific majesty simultaneously. There are no sharp demarcations where, and this is where now we begin to understand the nature of the intelligibles themselves and how they act. And in the next chapter, which we will get to the week following next, in the chapter of Seth, there's a few statements that Ibn Arabi starts to make about the non-existence of these things in a very absolute sense, that are very, very Zen, that begin to, that kind of then begin to break down rationalistic notions of what we're dealing with, which is good. So what he's doing is he's building all these conceptual tools, and then in the following chapter, he bang smashes them, right? So that then you begin to reformulate your own understanding of what these things are. Ultimately, right, as he's saying at the very third paragraph of this text, is that these concepts cannot be arrived at rationally. You cannot think your way through it. This is something that he's underscored. You have to experience what this reality is. Hence, why I've offered that you all recite a zikr, the zikr of Ya Allah, and then the following 26 zikrs and names related to each of the chapters. Because if by your own experience of these things and from the own experiential domain, and when you start to think about these issues, these things, information, true information, veridical information about these things starts to seep into your consciousness. I remember about 30 years ago when I started reading this text, I became so obsessed in understanding this text, and I was reading each of these chapters so many times that I began to dream them, of the things that Ibn Arabi were talking about in the Fusus al-Hikam. I'm not saying you should do that, but I was obsessed at that time with Ibn Arabi. But what it did is showed me and allowed me a way to understand what it is talking about, because he's putting this caveat in from the very beginning of this text that you cannot think your way through this. This is not something that you can think through. Even all the terms and everything that he's putting, that certain philosophers have a serious problem with what Ibn Arabi is saying. Nevertheless, from a higher plane, from the plane of tasting that Ibn Arabi is coming from, they make absolute sense. And so they're not rational, but super rational, right? Doesn't mean they're non-rational, but they're super rational. They defy,
meta-rational.
Yeah, they defy the dualistic logic, of the kind that you find in Aristotle. So there are excluded middles. The law of the excluded middle does not apply at all to the kind of stuff that Ibn Arabi is talking about. But by the same token, he's very careful to demarcate the various vantage points and of things, so that people don't get confused about what is what. Anybody else?
I just have a quick question, I guess.
Sure.
If the names and attributes are infinite,
Mhm.
and the purpose of creation is for God to know himself, would that then necessarily imply that what Ibn Arabi is saying is that creation itself is infinite and will last forever? And if
Great
so,
question.
does that mean that he is, would that, how was something like that received
Yes and no.
by his contemporaries?
Yes and no. Well, next week we'll actually get to the question directly, because the next half of the text actually addresses this. Yes and no, but I'll answer it this way now. The universe is eternal only by virtue of its dependence on the al-Hikam, but it is contingent by virtue of itself. Okay, but yes, the universe or the cosmos, the Kaun al-Jami, that the great, the universal being, is not co-eternal as an equal with God. It is co-eternal in terms of being God's mirror to look at himself for however long the Godhead wishes to do that. So in essence, Ibn Arabi is actually maintaining both positions. He's both maintaining creatio ex nihilo, that the creation in time that the exoteric religions believe in, and the eternity of creation that the philosophers believe in. It just depends on which angle of the perspective that you're looking at. So insofar as the universe is dependent on the Godhead, it is a sui generic creation. But insofar as the universe in the total scheme of things, then it is eternal. But next week, this is the precise question that this next half of the Fusus is dealing with. Okie dokie. Let's leave it here for this week, and next week, inshallah, and hopefully this recording is done. This time around, we're not going to have any more problems. Whoever recorded it on their end, if they get it and I have a problem, please send it to me. But as of now, I think we have a recording. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. So until next time, Ya Allah.
Sorry, I have a quick clerical question. I don't know where to access the Dhikr. Where can I access the Dhikr?
I will send it to you again.
Okay, great, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you have my email, but just in the Telegram group and I can get it from there.
Okay.
Okay. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Ya Haq.